And it is always a pleasure to talk to my next guest. I always look forward to it. Richard Wolff is Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He's a visiting professor in the Graduate Program of International Affairs at the New School. He is also the host of a program you should listen to, Economic Update on Free Speech TV. It is also a podcast, I believe, and he is the founder of Democracy at Work, which is at democracyatwork.info, and there's a lot to catch up on. So without further ado, Richard Wolff, as always, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Richard. I'm glad to be here.
Now, let's start with this, because we're still... by the way, this was perhaps in multiple ways the least consequential Super Bowl that I can remember, both in terms of points on the board, musical halftime entertainment, and but not consequential under the surface when you think about some of the forces at work, including Colin Kaepernick. But let's just start with that. First of all, what are your overall thoughts, if any, about the Super Bowl?
Well, I also found it to be just this side of boring, at least for large parts of it. I am each year a little more grossed out by the commercialization, let's call it, of sports, the way in which more and more of the details, whether it's the design of the uniform, whether it's the halftime show, whether it's the blizzard of PR before and during, it is so obvious that an enormous portion of what's going on here is about making money and advertising to pull money out of our wallets for whatever it is the hucksters are selling, that the actual athleticism, the skill and finesse that these athletes bring is almost a lost marginal aspect. And frankly, I'm offended, because it was the athletics that always attracted me. I played football in high school. It meant a lot to me then. And I regret that this spectacle of commercialism is pretty much overwhelming most of the rest of it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think that spectacle of commercialism showed itself in multiple different ways. But one of them, I'm so happy you mentioned this sort of the fact that it used to be about the primacy of athletic skill and athletic competition. That's what it's supposed to be about. But we already know that the NFL is not about that anymore, because if it were, there are multiple quarterbacks that played this season who were not at the skill level of Colin Kaepernick. So I would say, I mean, this is my personal feeling, I would say if this was really about the skill, Cap would have been quarterbacking, and he wasn't. And clearly ideology and the desire to impose upon a worker, even a well-paid worker in this case, ideological and political and social conformity trumped the desire to have the best athletes possible on the field. That's my takeaway.
Well, the way I'm pretty close to you. The way I would put it is that I think the people who made this decision at the top ranks of the NFL were really, they were aware that he was a superior athlete and ought to be out there, but they didn't care. That's what offends me. They need to make money. That's to quote them, the bottom line. That's the top priority. That's the point of it all. And you had a problem here, not so much that the people were divided, because from the polls I could see, people supporting Mr. Kaepernick were probably more numerous than those who were objecting to him. So that wasn't the problem. I think the problem was President Trump. The notion that he could go out there and basically be an advertising lambaster, revving up the media, revving up the attention, revving up his political base, so that people began to think that they ought to not go to an NFL event, not turn on the TV, feel hostile towards whoever's advertising the NFL event. This was a threat to how much money they can make, and supporting Mr. Kaepernick as the best athlete just is not as important as keeping that money flowing. And that's what I'm objecting to, because I think you're right. That's an example of we being denied the athletics that we really want because they can make more money by doing that to us.
Well, and here's another angle on all of this, Richard Wolff, which is you played football in high school. For years, even in my 20s, I was a rock musician. So I come to the halftime show with a certain sense of judgment. And this Maroon 5, look, their lead singer is technically extremely good and all that. They were not the first choice for halftime act. They were not the second choice. They were not the third choice. So whenever people in social media or just in real life said they didn't like the band that much, I said, well, don't forget they weren't just mediocre, they were scabs. Because the reason why choice number 1, choice number 2, choice number 3 didn't come is because, of course, they wanted to respect the boycott, and they wanted to, they were standing, someone like Beyonce, for example, was standing in, as I understand it, in solidarity with Colin Kaepernick. So what we got instead was, I think I called them the perfect band for bro capitalism. I mean, they seem to communicate, and I don't hate the band, you know what I mean, but they seem to, I know a lot of people who do, but I don't. I just think they seem to symbolize in the nature of their show this sort of ostentatious display of self. And it went along with the whole packaging that I think may be part of what you've been talking about, the fireworks and the, it's all conspicuous consumption, and the $5,000 tickets, which when you look at the ticket to field goal ratio, this had to be the worst deal in Super Bowl history. To me, it was all about the kind of bread and roses that an empire in decline might put on.
Yeah, and I would, the silver lining perhaps you might put on it is this, that for me, the halftime show, which I also found to be relative to what I had hoped for, boring, was a display of people who have the same values as the NFL.
Right.
I suspect they were sympathetic with Colin Kaepernick, but more important than their solidarity with him and with all that his peaceful protest entailed, more important to them was making the big bucks that they get from appearing at the midtime show in the Super Bowl. And so they were consistent with the NFL leadership. They were putting what was for them first things first, and the rest, who cares? That attitude is, as you put it, and I think you're very right about it, that attitude is the attitude of a ship going down. That is the behavior of people who are not concerned about the larger situation, don't care about which way the society is developing. They're in it for me, and the money I can put in the bank. And that kind of attitude dissolves the society. It doesn't hold it together.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And before we go off the topic of the NFL, I'm thinking of revisiting. Several years back, I looked at the NFL's budget to the extent that I could get it as an expression of inequality, and I found out that Goodell's, the head of the NFL's salary was a huge chunk of the NFL budget. His number 2 guy's salary was another good-sized chunk, and then the rest of it had to be distributed for everything else, including the salary of the other 1,000+ employees of the NFL organization, plus all his contractors and vendors and suppliers. So in other words, I found from what I could glean that the NFL's finances were in microcosm the kind of unequal society we live in today. I just thought that was interesting.
Yes, it was. It's interesting that we're working so parallel right now. I had to give a talk a couple nights ago about what's going on in America's universities. And one of the things I discovered in preparing for that talk was the same lopsided overpayment of a handful of people at the top of most universities, the president, the vice president, and all of that, coupled together with an endless kind of nickel and diming of the professors, of the graduate students, and help in the teaching, all the things that a university is importantly doing, you haven't got the money for, but you pay wild salaries and perks for the folks at the top, replicating big corporations who do the same. It's the kind of infection of the whole society from the structure of the big enterprises that sit at the top.
And I'm afraid we replicate that, Richard Wolff, to a certain extent, if not financially, then with our attention and energy. I think there's a political equivalent to that, too. I think that American politics nowadays, we invest all our energy in the few celebrity politicians at the top. You know, when people hear that I work in politics or that there's a political nature to my work, I inevitably get asked, what do you think about the 2020 presidential race? You know, what do you think of Kamala? What do you think of Beto? What do you think of this one or that one? Even Bernie. And I like Bernie, but I used to work for Bernie, but nobody ever asks me, what do you think of the movements that are trying to influence this election? What do you think of the Sunrise Movement? What do you think of Black Lives Matter? What do you think about the DSA? What do you think about, or what do you think about prospects to getting genuinely left people in at lower levels in state offices or whatever? Nobody talks about that. We have the same sort of let's identify a few superstars and forget the rank and file who get the work done. It's what it seems to me.
Yeah, no, I could not agree more. It's a very sad, but for me, again, a very powerful commentary on the disintegration of collectivity. You know, it's one thing to celebrate individualism, but it's like a coach with a team. You want each of the members of your basketball or baseball or whatever team you're talking about, you want them to excel and have a sense of themselves. But you also have to balance that with a concept of teamwork and the team and sharing and facilitating each other's strengths. And if you don't do that, if your team is not a team but a collection of 5 or 10 or 9 individuals, you're going to lose. And this is a message that applies to society as well. I think we're in a place which I blame on a capitalist system because of its focus on me, in which we just keep losing the balance, the socialization, the collectivity, the teamwork, whatever you want to call it, and become these folks who see nothing else except their own individual, quote unquote, bottom line.
So, and again, we're talking with economist Richard Wolff. So I didn't plan to do this, Richard, but for whatever reason, and I'm going to mention it now because I so appreciate what you just said. Of all things, I decided to start reading The Conquest of Bread by Kropotkin again. And here's a phrase that jumped out at me, well, multiple things do still. I mean, among other things, he was quite a good writer. He was the anarchist, communist philosopher of the 19th century. He says, time was when a peasant family could consider the corn which it grew or the woolen garments woven in the cottage as the products of its own toil. But even then, this way of looking at things was not quite correct. There were the roads and the bridges made in common, the swamps drained by common toil, and the communal pastures enclosed by hedges, which are kept in repair by each and all of the looms for weaving or the dyes for coloring fabrics. He goes on and on. So even in those days, a peasant family could not live alone, but nowadays everything is independent, is basically interdependent, is where he goes with that. And now I would say that when Barack Obama and Elizabeth Warren made tentative steps to express the "you didn't build that" political argument, I don't think they would have openly acknowledged or even been aware of an intellectual relationship to Kropotkin. So I wouldn't have expected that from them. But even their genteel mentioning of what should be a self-evident fact, that things are produced on the basis of interdependence, was so shouted down that I know Obama, for one, beat a hasty retreat from the very idea. And I don't hear people talking about it this time around.
No, and I think it's again, I believe it's a sign of a social disintegration, that you have this sort of visceral reaction to feeling so defensive about your individual effort, which is part of this story. You have every right, as each individual does, to reflect about, to be proud about what he or she has individually contributed. But the notion that you're so defensive about your individuality that you have to repress and expel and expunge your interdependence with other people, that's pathological. That's taking a reasonable individualism and making it a pathological individualism, something that has to deny and repress its interdependence. Everything we do is interdependent. If you study the development of the baby into an adulthood, you discover that the baby learns what he or she is by looking literally at the reflection that is coming from the parents, the mother, the father, the relative, the sister, the brother, the family, pet, you name it. We are the sum total of our interactions with the physical world, with other human beings. And the notion that I made myself is a level of conceit, and it's pathological. It is a sign of a society spinning out of control.
Now, I wanted to ask your opinion on something that may also be. I don't want to lead the witness, but it may also be a sign of a certain pathology. And I'm going to take a turn here. We'll decide which direction the turn is. But I've been watching for some time now, and you mentioned the universities and the star system and so on. I've been watching a couple star intellectuals, and they do still exist, highly paid university professors who have a celebrity status and write best-selling books and so on. I've been fascinated by the rise of the school of thought, and Steven Pinker is a leading exponent of it, but there are others. This school of thought arising in our sort of establishment intellectual class or elite intellectual class, a school of thought that says Marshall's statistics, I and others would argue in a biased way, but Marshall's statistics, in order to say that life for human beings is getting better and better all the time. And there are fewer people in poverty worldwide than there used to be. Therefore, in effect, the argument is, what's all the fuss about? Why are you people, stirring up so much trouble? And it came into the news most recently because Bill Gates tweeted an infographic as Davos, as the gathering of our overlords in the World Economic Forum began, tweeted it saying, "This is one of my favorite infographics. A lot of people underestimate just how much life has improved over the past 2 centuries." Now, several people have dispelled that infographic, but why is it that we now have an intellectual subculture, at least, that's devoted to, first of all, is it true, in your opinion, that things are getting better? And of course, there are still questions, even if it is, about what our moral obligations are. But why is this something that's, all of a sudden become the topic of best-selling books and so on?
Well, let's go step by step. First, is it true or not? There has been, and it's, by the way, an old debate. It covers various historical periods, but this debate has been going on, and you could say roughly between left-wing and right-wing economic historians as to whether or not standards of living of the average person or of the mass of people is a trajectory from low to high, is a bouncing up and down, is a trajectory from high to low. All of those positions have been advocated by serious scholars. All of those positions have their supporting statistics. For Mr. Gates to present this as if it were a settled matter is at best a sign that the man is ignorant of this entire literature, which has been going on for decades, or he's a liar. I don't know which. I'm not going to blame him. But either way, this outcome works It doesn't go to enhancing his reputation. And that's true for others as well. There are professors who make an argument like Mr. Gates, who do advance specific arguments that take into account and try to rebut the alternatives of which they are respectful. Mr. Gates didn't do that. He acted in his speech as if this is a settled universal matter. It isn't. And just a couple of details, and then I'll answer your question about why it's happening. Number one, long-term statistics in economics are just one step above useless. And the reason for that is not badness or goodness. The reason for that is that if you go back more than 30 or 40 years, the amount of statistics collected is haphazard. The manner in which they are gathered is haphazard. The manner in which they are put together to print those nice, neat tables in government documents and in books is a nice rendering in a clean way of something that is fundamentally haphazard, inadequate, and for basic arguments, simply unreliable. I have no quarrel with someone who says to us, here's a series of numbers. The ones that go back more than 50 years are highly dubious. They may give us a reasonable sense of orders of magnitude, but beyond that, no. Mr. Gates didn't do that. And most of the people that make these arguments act as if the quality of statistics about the early 20th century or the 19th century, or even more wildly periods of time before that, those are people, again, I'm trying to be polite, that are dishonest. That's the politest term I could come up with. Number two, all statistics require interpretation. What number you decide to look at, how you decide to look at it, what measuring tools you use, these are issues about which good, honest people disagree. And when you choose to go in one direction or another, you get different results. An honest discussion admits all of that, lays it all out, and then we do the best we can. A dishonest discussion acts as though one particular measure is either the only one or in some weird way the best one. You know, it's as if you looked at a variety of religions that people believed. But instead of saying, look how interesting it is, Muslims look at it this way and Catholics that way and Protestants some other way. No. You say, this is the right one, all the other ones are wrong. I mean, whoa, you'd be drawn up short and be told, that's not an interesting conversation and it is deeply offensive and intolerant. That's my reaction to all of this. As to why it happens, I think that's easy. That's the easy part, Richard. We have an unprecedented level of inequality here in the United States right now. And it comes at the end of a period, I would call it the period of 1940 to 1980, when this country had a kind of large middle class, and in which the ideologues of capitalism praised capitalism on the grounds precisely that it didn't allow extremes of unequal wealth, which was half true, and at least the half that was true was that we have a large, pretty well-off middle class. Employed workers, usually union members, able to get not just a wage for the man who works, but enough for a family wage to take care of a wife at home doing the housework and the childcare and so on, having some benefits in the form of a medical coverage. Yes, we did that. Did we do it for all people? Not even close. But we did it for a large enough portion in the middle that we could claim that capitalism was a good system for the average worker, and we could wish at least that those who didn't get it would be getting it in the future. Over the last 30 years, basically 40 years since 1980, it has become crystal clear that the direction of American capitalism is taking away that middle class relentlessly year after year, that the country is polarizing into a 1% or 10% at the top, and everybody else who's having a harder and harder time. We have the first generation of college students working under a debt burden that shouldn't be imposed on anyone, let alone a young person starting out in his or her life. And so, of course, defensiveness for the rich has to find an argument. And the only argument they can find to face an enraged population that sees the inequality literally every hour is to try to get them to focus instead on this putative and largely phony long-term improvement. We should look at the improvement rather than the inequality that oppresses us now. We should look backwards rather than at the present and the future that frightens us so now. It is a defensive maneuver to try to deflect social criticism of inequality today. Last point. For me, and I'm one of many who thinks this, the transition from feudalism that existed before to capitalism is a complicated process that took place between the 15th century and the 19th century, more or less. It included, in some cases, people whose standard of living over that period of time improved. It included other people whose standard of living over that time deteriorated. You take one look at Charles Dickens' England, and you can find countless accounts of people who were peasants in England who came to London or Liverpool or Lancashire and discovered that they had left what was poverty in the rural to live in an even more squalid urban slum instead. This wasn't an improvement. It was a deterioration. But, as the article in the Guardian you cite shows, if you measure everything by money, which is not the way to measure it because peasant families have most of their income in kind, not in money, right, then you get a different picture. But that's because of your measuring rod, not because of the underlying situation. So for all these reasons, I think it's very important to call out what Mr. Gates did there for the defensive maneuver it was.
And one of the fascinating things about, thank you for that, one of the fascinating things about this argument to me is that I've heard it repeated by people who strongly seem to believe it. I mean, to me, it's almost, it's a psychological and an anthropological question to me about why they believe it so much, because I think it's a defense mechanism against the appalling reality of the truth that their lives reflect, frankly. And it also,
if I could add, Richard,
sure,
you're right. If I could add, here's an extra dimension of it. Many of those intellectuals you're referring to who make these comments were, if you scratch the surface, when they were younger men and women, inclined to a critical attitude towards capitalism, indulging what they could see around them in the communities they grew up in the schools and colleges where teachers gave them a chance to think critically, at least for a while. But they made their accommodation with the system. They gave up the critical impulses. They gave up the critical ideas. They joined the system to cash in on its rewards. They are now confronted with a kind of painful mirror that says, you betrayed ideas you had for a system that isn't working right now. And rather than face that and face that they may have made a big mistake, they then become even more defensive by encountering and developing arguments like this historical escape from poverty, because it becomes self-justificatory about their own changes of heart as they grew up.
You know, that's so helpful. You couldn't see me nodding just now as you were speaking, but it also helps me understand, for example, the phenomenon I've seen so much. I remember, for example, President Obama, who was notably unflappable, and we can disagree without being disagreeable was his mantra and so on. The only time I ever saw him getting really genuinely vituperative and angry was when he was criticized from the left. And it seems to me there might be similar phenomenon taking place. And by the way, just to close this side of this discussion, not only is their argument unproven and most likely, in my opinion, false, to employ it the way they employ it would be barbaric, even if it's true. To me, it's the moral equivalent of saying, when I went out yesterday, there were 12 dying children on my lawn. Today, there are only 3, so I don't have to do anything to save their lives. It doesn't matter how many there are. If there's only one, you should be acting to save that life. So it seems to me it's being
right. That's right. Even if the argument were in some way we could determine true, and we can't. But even if hypothetically it were true, it has nothing to do with the moral, ethical, economic acceptability of having some people like Jeffrey Bezos own $150 billion worth of property and half the population of this planet unable to get by on $2 a day. I mean, there is no religion I'm aware of that finds that anything other than horrible in the eyes of whatever moral and ethical standards it advances. And yet we have to listen to people who say, well, it isn't anything you should worry about because of this historical trajectory.
Well, as you were talking about Jeffrey Bezos, I was thinking, I'm so old, I remember when Jeffrey Bezos only had $46 billion, but wait, that was 2016, I think, actually.
Yes, that's right.
So, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. There's so much more I would love to talk to you about, Richard Wolff. But again, Richard Wolff is an economist. He is a professor at the New School. He is the host of Economic Update on Free Speech TV and also available as a podcast. So once again, Richard, thank you so much for coming on the program. We really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, Richard. I appreciate the opportunity.